Welcome to the Music Nut program. I'm John. Thank you so much for joining me today for the first edition of It's Thin Lizzy Thursday. It's going to be a privilege to talk about one of my favorite bands. This series will focus on their 12 studio albums. I will do one album each episode, and then on the 13th episode, which will take us to the end of 2024, I will give my list of my least favorite to favorite albums by Thin Lizzy, and also talk about their live albums, Live and Dangerous and Life Live. Before I get started, I'm going to give a plug, and I'm not going to talk about coffee. I'm going to talk about a book called Honesty is No Excuse. This was written by Martin Popoff. This is a panel book, Thin Lizzy on Record, Honesty is No Excuse, where a panel of, as Mart would say, musical swamis talk about their impressions of each of the studio albums by Thin Lizzy. I am privileged to be part of this book. And everybody in this book did a fantastic job. Thin Lizzy was formed in 1969. The original lineup before they went on record was Phil Lynott, who was their main songwriter on bass guitar, acoustic guitar, and lead vocals, Brian Downey on drums and percussion, Eric Bell on lead guitars and 12-string guitar, Eric Rickson on keyboards. They would play their first gig in January 1970 at St. Anthony's Hall in Dublin, Ireland. Eric Rickson would leave the band after a few months. The band would become a trio, and they would record this self-titled debut on Decca Records that was released on April 30, 1971. How is this album? What does this album sound like? To me, this is one of those great, different, yet interesting albums where a band is really trying to find their sound. And I love albums like this. I'm a sucker for them. I love Scorpions' Lonesome Crow. I love Judas Priest, Rock'n'Rolla. I love this album as well. Are there albums I love more? Yes. But I go back to this album quite often these days. This was released on Decca Records, and it was supposedly released on a shoestring budget. I will tell you, this remaster from 2007, the recording on this is impeccable. The clarity, the space between the instruments is very evident here. Excellent recording of this album. And let's go over the tracks. The Friendly Ranger at Clontarf Castle. Clontarf was a town in Ireland near Dublin where Phil Lynott and Eric Bell once shared a house. Now, this works more like an intro than a song itself. It starts out very psychedelic. You got some bongos going on in the background, some spoken word poetry here from Phil. And it's this playing on here is very subdued. Phil's vocals on this album, in my humble opinion, are the strongest of his career. I think as time went on, and very well evident on the last few albums, his voice lost a lot of its power and eventually a lot of its soul. But here, his voice was in full bloom. This leads into Honesty is No Excuse. Honesty is No Excuse to me is Phil trying to be like another fantastic Irish songwriter, Van Morrison. This sounds very much like Astral Weeks, particularly with the acoustic guitars and a lot of Mellotron on here. From the get-go, Brian Downey's a beast on drums. He's throwing in a lot of fills. If I was to say who he would sound the most like at this point, I'd probably say Mitch Mitchell from Jimi Hendrix Experience, but more power. Now, this is a pretty good song. The leads here by Eric are more for color. Phil is, this is a very whimsical love story. which Phil would give us a lot of great tales of love and lost love for many years to come. This is one of the better, stronger tracks on the album. Diddy Levine is an epic. You ever hear any songs where it sounds like two songs being put together and it's kind of obvious? That's what this is. Like, this isn't like Victim of Changes, which was actually two songs put together. This isn't Sometime World by Wishbone Ash, which was two songs put together. Both that song and Victim of Changes don't sound like they're put together. They sound very cohesive. This doesn't, but it's still a very interesting song. It's an acoustic number at first. Phil's lyrics on here are very personal. He's singing a lot about what he was going through at the time of his life. Irish life, a lot about family. It's a story song in the fact that we talk about the characters in the story. He's talking about them at a young age, and then what would they would become after the solo is over. This is a song very folky and mellow, and then at 3 minutes in, it kicks into a heavier song. Brian's drumming really, really worked very well on this. It's a very repetitive riff from that point. It's, it's kind of heavy, but it doesn't really get super heavy. It just keeps that same riff the whole time. Phil's bass lines on here, I think at times I think are really creative. And sometimes I think they're just a little too busy. And then it goes back into that main theme at 4:45. I think the song ends very well. I just don't think it's very cohesive, but it's still a song that I always go back to it. I think this is one that's going to continue to grow on me over the years. It just hasn't quite reached me yet. Ray Gun. I say this in this book. This sounds like an outtake from Jimi Hendrix Experience, Electric Ladyland. One thing about Eric throughout this album, but very apparent on this one, he really loves his wah-wah pedal. Bass lines under Eric's guitar are pretty cool. You got some killer fills in the musical bridge by Brian. But yes, this is very Hendrix. Even in the lyrics, it kind of sounds very Hendrix. It's decent. Look What the Wind Blew In is my favorite song on the proper album. This is more akin to what would come later, although you don't have those beautiful twin guitar harmonies yet. But Phil's personality and his charisma are already coming to the forefront here. Very good chorus on here, cool riffs on it. It's a cool tune. Then we go back to folk on Ire. Eric's playing on this works well for the song. It's very somber and very harrowing, in my opinion. Phil's vocal, very strong on this. The lead that Eric takes during the fade out, this is only a little over 2 minutes long, is pretty cool. Return of the Farmer's Son, we go back to a song in the Irish tradition here with the very personal lyrics. You got some nice ad libs in this song from Phil during the musical bridge, and Brian's drumming on here really kicks tail. Very cool tune. Musical bridge, I think, is more based on scales. It's decent. It sounds a little incomplete, but there are definitely things to really like on this song. Clifton Grange Hotel. This was the inn that was managed by Phil Lynnett's mother, Philomena. This is decent. It does sound like the riffs and the songs are just spliced together. Bass line in the second part of the song, I think, is pretty cool. It's not very cohesive. It's okay. Saga of the Aging Orphan. Now we're going back to folk again. Phil's most tender, reflective vocal on the album. And there is a nice sense of drama on here that works, even though it stays in that vein there, the folk vein. It is pretty. It is a cool tune. Remembering Part One. Now, this is the closer. This sounds a lot like The Who, particularly when they go into those loud dramatic choruses on here with those loud guitar chords. It goes from soft verses, loud choruses, works well as a closer, works well as a show ender to me, even though the song is simple musically, because we're basically just going from we're going basically from soft to loud. We have a nice little bass solo in here. There's a more wah-wah guitars underneath the surface. I think it would have worked a little better if it was a little shorter track, but it's a decent open. Now, on my version of the self-titled album, we have some bonus tracks. We have their first single called The Farmer, and this is a decent folk song where you do have the keyboards on here. It's decent. It definitely shows that Phil's trying to find his way as a songwriter. The New Day EP, which would be the next four songs I talk about, was released 2 months after the self-titled debut album. And I will tell you, you already saw the band maturing and becoming more cohesive on this EP. The first song is Dublin. This is like a love letter from Phil to his hometown of Dublin, Ireland. Very pretty, nice slice of life song, I should say. The electric guitars are very subtle, as is the electric piano on this as well. Remembering Part Two, New Day. Repetitive, kind of like Part One. It's actually more repetitive than Part One because we're just going bouncing between two chords in the verses, and we add a third chord in the chorus. But it's very spirited. This is written by the band. The chorus is short but memorable. What you really hear on here is Eric Bell's guitar playing really improving. This is a cool song, as is Old Moon Madness. Again, I love Eric's lyrical soloing on here. Here comes that wah wah pedal again. The difference between the New Day EP and the self-titled debut in regards to Eric's playing. He's using the wah wah better on here. It's not he's not just using it just to show off. Here it's more cohesive. Here it works better on the songs. He's just not in love with the wah wah anymore, if you know what I mean. The bass lines on here are really cool. Phil does a spoken word vocal on this. It's an interesting song. It's pretty cool. Now, things ain't working out down at the farm. To me, should have been on the debut. I think this should have closed the debut and then maybe put Remembering Part One as a side one closer. But this plays like an anthem. We got a nice little bridge in here before Eric's solo kicks in. Phil's vocal is tremendous. He sings with a lot of passion, charisma. This should be on the debut. And this is nearly as good as some of the best songs on some of the other albums with Eric, I would say. This is nearly as good as a Whiskey in a Jar, which they didn't write, of course, but it would become their first big hit in Ireland. And that's the self-titled debut by Thin Lizzy, as well as the New Day EP. So, what do you think of Thin Lizzy? Are you a big fan? Do you only just know the big hits in the United States or the big hits in Europe? In the UK, they had a lot of hits. Here, they're more known for Boys Are Back in Town and Jailbreak. cowboy song. Whiskey in a Jar got introduced to a new generation when Metallica covered it. And sorry, Thin Lizzy's version's much better. Do you own this album? And what do you think of this album? What do you think of their early albums when they were really trying to find their sound? What do you think of their folk leanings on here? What do you think of Phil's vocals? What do you think of Eric's guitar playing? Is Brian Downey one of the best drummers that is very seldom spoken about? Please let me know in the comments. Join me next week on It's Thin Lizzy Thursday when I talk about their second album, Shades of a Blue Orphanage. Okay, some programming notes for you. Yesterday, Wednesday, October 2nd, we filmed the Balls to the Wall episode of the Accept series going on my friend John Clauser's channel, My Music Corner. Our guest this week is Mangus DC. So please check that out if you're a big Accept fan. It's Smithereen Saturday will continue this Saturday when I talk about their final studio album while Pat Denizio was alive, and that's 2011. Also was released yesterday, or was dropped yesterday, I should say. I appeared on Rock Daydream Nation along with my friend Peter Kerr, and we talked about Steve Earle's 1988 album, Copperhead Road. Is this a heavy metal country album? You decide. There's your programming notes. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope I see you next week when I talk about Shades of a Blue Orphanage. Until I see you again, do what you love, and I'll talk to you soon.